The 2023 Monaco Grand Prix has come and gone, and we're here to talk about what happened, go over for the predictions that I made before the race weekend began, and go over a surprisingly decent Monaco Grand Prix. Let's talk about it. Monaco Grand Prix rarely seems to be that exciting, but it does have its moments. Qualifying always seems to be the most exciting that we'll see all year, and this year was no different. As a person who's only been following Formula One since the 2022 season, this is definitely, without a doubt, hands down the best qualifying session that I think I've ever seen in my, admittedly a year and a bit of following Formula One. But I know a lot of people online have been talking about how this qualifying session might have been one of the best of all time. I think that Q3 session just sums up how exciting Monaco can be, even if the race doesn't always live up to, the grandeur of it all. But seeing realistically almost four different drivers have the opportunity to take pole position, Fernando Alonso putting in the lap he needed right at the end, and then Max Verstappen making up about 3/10 in about 2.5 corners. It was absolutely astonishing to see, and honestly, it was one of the most exciting sessions of Formula One I think I've ever watched. Now, that didn't necessarily translate into excitement for the race, but that qualifying session will be memorable for years and years to come. But some other things that happened that I think were pretty fun and exciting. We'll take a step back from qualifying and start looking at practice. I think practice had a handful of exciting moments, and none of them more exciting than when both the Red Bull and the Mercedes were lifted up hundreds of feet into the air by the cranes after some unfortunate crashes in the practice sessions. And so we got to see the new Merc floor that they brought to Monaco that they're hoping to get some advantage of, as well as, and probably admittedly more exciting, the RB19 floor finally, revealed to the world. I know a lot of F1 engineers are going to be taking a long, hard look and probably paying a good chunk of money to some photographers that got shots of that RB19 floor for sure. But looking ahead to the race itself now, I think everyone was a little expecting of what it seems like always happens at Monaco, which is it becomes very processional outside of the first lap, where obviously that's the best opportunity drivers have to make overtakes. And the real excitement for this race came in about 55 laps in, when they're in sector 2, all of a sudden spatting of rain that looked like it might have held off for the entire weekend comes through, and we actually turn sector 2 into basically a swimming pool, while sectors 1 and 3 are effectively dry. Seeing these drivers tiptoe around on slicks, used slicks, very, very used slicks, was pretty entertaining to watch, I would say. We got to see lots of interesting strategy calls, mainly Fernando Alonso choosing to go to mediums over inters, when I think the rest of the grid was on that same lap choosing to come in for intermediate tires. That ultimately, I think, personally, think that kept Fernando from realistically challenging for the win at that point. The biggest what if of this weekend might have been, what if Fernando Alonso had gone to inters instead of mediums at that first spatting of rain? What might have been, it would have been close, but it might have been a little bit closer than the 30-second gap there was at the actual end of the race. Fernando ends up coming home in P2. Again, we mentioned that what if, we'll never really know, but another podium for Fernando Alonso, and improves his best finishing position to second over third that he's had so many times before. And then also we'll give a special shout out to Esteban Ocon, puts in a magical lap in qualifying, and with the aid of a Charles Leclerc grid penalty, is promoted to starting P3. And you know what? He held his own, held himself in check, and finishes on the podium in Monaco for, I believe I saw, is only his third podium of his career. So congratulations to Esteban. I know not everyone was really expecting that, but hey, it might be one of the few chances we have to see a non-Red Bull on the podium, or non-Red Bull, or none of the top 4 teams on the podium. So congrats, Esteban. What a weekend for the Alpine driver. Lewis comes home in P4, and George just behind. I think Mercedes had a really good weekend outside of Lewis's crash in FP3. It was a weekend they really needed, with Aston Martin still kind of only being a one-man band with Fernando Alonso. They continue to make up ground on Aston Martin for second in the constructors. They now are only 1 point behind of Aston Martin for second in the constructors. So going to be an interesting fight between those two, while Red Bull just cruised out in the lead for the rest of the way. Ferrari doesn't do anything too crazy. They actually had a pretty decent weekend. It's just, they're just really not on the pace. And throw in Charles's grid penalty in qualifying, and really, you're just looking at a pretty lackluster weekend. And once the rain started, they kind of waited, I think, a little too long to pull in either Sainz or Leclerc for inters. I think they were waiting for a potential safety car, which amazingly did not come. But at the end of the day, it was what it was. But I also want to give a special shout out to Nick DeVries and talk about a guy who needed a good weekend like a fish needs water. I think this is definitely 100% Nick's best weekend in Formula One so far. So congrats on Nick for not, I didn't really see much of him during the race, but I think at this point for him, that's definitely a win. He came home in P12, and I think he'll take that every single day of the week. And then really, I think if you were to sum up this Monaco in, a rating, I think if you're looking at Monaco as a race on the calendar, this race ended up being about a 7 out of 10 personally. But in terms of being a Monaco race, I think it ended up being about a 9 out of 10 in terms for Monaco. The rain really threw a wrench into everything. The strategy, we got to see some actual strategy calls that shook up the field a little bit, and it ended up being a very exciting finish after the first 50 laps where it didn't necessarily look like much was realistically going to happen. So that's my quick hits for the race. If I missed anything, let me know down in the comments. But now we're going to head over and we're going to look at the predictions I made before the weekend started. I'm going to see how I did. If you're new here, we do a predictions video before every single race weekend, and this weekend was no different. The predictions that we make are biggest positive surprise, biggest disappointment, our qualifying top 3, our race results top 3, and finally, it's this channel's special quirk that we like to make our Haas prediction of the week. As a Haas fan, I always like to throw that in at the end, and then at the end, I like to assign 1 point for each step of a prediction, and so we'll see how many points I get at the end of this one. But we'll start now with our biggest positive surprise, and I said that Kevin Magnussen was going to be my biggest positive surprise. I think he had a very, very successful Miami Grand Prix, and I was hoping and imagining and dreaming that he was going to carry that momentum forward into Monaco, and realistically it just didn't work out. And I think at the end of the day, Haas just had a very forgettable weekend as a whole, and so unfortunately no points for that one, as Kevin Magnussen he had some moments during the race, but ultimately when you qualify near the bottom, you're not really qualified too much to count as a biggest positive surprise. So unfortunately, I'm 0 for 1 in my biggest positive surprise. But if we look forward now to my biggest disappointment, I think this one was always a little bit easier of a category to pick. And of course, I went with the McLaren team being as my biggest disappointment. I think this year they've just been very up and down in a car that is just not very good, and they bring a special livery. I think the vibes were just off about McLaren going into Monaco. And you know what? It was a touch and go qualifying, but then during the race, a double points finish proves me wrong pretty much every time. So unfortunately, I also go over when it comes to the biggest disappointment, as McLaren has a double points finish and ultimately a pretty solid weekend at the end of the day. Next up, we have the most important part of Monaco, qualifying results. And you know what? I almost nailed this to a T, except for the fact that I was nowhere close, because my qualifying results prediction was a Charles Leclerc pole, a Max Verstappen P2, and a Sergio Perez P3. Obviously, Checo crashing out effectively after his first lap of qualifying, ends up qualifying P20, and so I could not almost be as wrong as that, as Checo gives me a nod on that one. Charles almost takes pole, but unfortunately was knocked back by Fernando Alonso as well as Max Verstappen, and before his grid penalty anyway. And so I go 0 for 3 on my qualifying results. I nailed 2 of the names, but just the wrong order, unfortunately. A similar story can be said about the race results. Obviously, if you get the qualifying prediction wrong for Monaco, you're very likely to have a race podium prediction incorrect as well. I said that Charles Leclerc was going to buck the Monaco curse and win his home race this season. And at the end of qualifying, I knew that this was very much likely not the case, as Ferrari's strategy in pit wall lets them down again. And unfortunately, Charles finished, I believe, in P6, and just he did finish P6. A very rough day for Ferrari. I had a Max Verstappen P2 and a Checo Perez P3. Max obviously went on to finish the race in first, and Checo finished in the bottom half of the grid. He tried to make a few moves and try to get a little punchy, but I mean, this is Monaco. What are we really talking about? I mean, there's only so much you can do. And honestly, and I'm going to tangent off of this briefly, but I think the fact that Checo got stuck behind Lance, who also had a very terrible qualifying, I think that didn't help Checo the most. I think he might have been able to pick his way through if Lance had qualified better. But I think Lance is capable enough to hold back Checo for long enough for the front group to get away. And that ultimately, I mean, Checo was going to need a perfect weekend, a perfect race to really make up much ground, and it just didn't end up working out. So race results, like qualifying results, 0 for 3. We got one of the names correct on the podium. It was Max, but I unfortunately pegged him for a second place finish, and of course he wins by 30 seconds. So it is what it is. And then finally, our Haas prediction of the race weekend. I had a lot of hopes for Haas. I predicted that they would get 2 cars into Q2, 1 car into Q3, and a points finish for Haas. This might have been the hopium coming off of Miami, but I end up going very much 0 for 3 on my Haas predictions. Both cars knocked out in Q1. And while Hulkenberg and Kevin tried to make the most of the race itself, ultimately at the end of the day, it was not Haas's weekend. We're very obviously moving on to Spain already, but at the end of the day, I may not have predicted it, but we'll have this fact and this fact alone. Both Haas cars out-qualified a Red Bull, and I'm taking that as a win, even if I don't get points for it. But my total points from the Monaco race weekend, for those of you who have been keeping track so far, you'll know that I actually went 0 for 11 on my Monaco race predictions. And I'm going to point this out, that I think it might actually be more impressive to get 0 predictions correct than to get all of them correct. So I may have gone over, but at the same time, I think it's very impressive that I got literally everything incorrect. But at the end of the day, not the best weekend for me, and not the best weekend for my overall points when I end up going back and tallying these up at the end of the season. But nonetheless, this is why we do it. It's just for fun. I'm hopefully going to learn to get better at this as we continue to move forward. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. That wraps up the Monaco race weekend. We have a quick turnaround with Spain coming up this coming weekend. And before we do wrap up completely, I want to give a special shout out to the Indy 500. It was a very fun watch to follow Monaco. A lot of excitement down the end of that one, with some big crashes coming. Thankfully, everyone seemed to be okay, including that tire that ended up escaping the infield and flying over a grandstand. And unfortunately for whoever's car it was, but fortunately in terms of, you know, the individual's safety, it only landed on a car and nothing else. But very exciting finish. It ends up coming down to a 1-lap shootout, and I'm already trying to figure out if it's possible to potentially go to that race next year. It seems like a lot of fun, and as a person who grew up 45 minutes from where they hold the Indianapolis 500, I actually have never been, and so we might have to add that to the calendar next season, but who knows. It seems like a lot of fun. We'll watch Monaco in the morning, Indy 500 right after. Seems like a good time to me. But that wraps up this week of Formula One predictions and review. What did you guys think of Monaco? Let me know down in the comments, and hit subscribe if you enjoy Formula One content, both either gaming or in real life. That's going to wrap it up for me here. Spain's right around the corner. We'll get to that. The predictions video will be up soon this week. But until then, I hope you guys enjoyed Monaco, and I'll see you guys in the next one.